All right, so welcome to another deep dive with us. Today, well, it's kind of like a movie plot almost. We're talking about Elon Musk, Mr. Tesla and SpaceX. Now he's got his sights on reshaping the whole U.S. federal government.
Wow.
Yeah. So we've been digging through a bunch of articles, The Guardian, Wall Street Journal, all sorts of places, and gotta say, they don't all agree on this whole thing,
Makes sense, I guess.
which honestly makes it even more interesting, right? So we're going to try to untangle what's really going on, what it might mean for, well, everyone, and
hmm
why folks are kind of raising their eyebrows at this whole situation.
Well, yeah, it's definitely caught a lot of attention, that's for sure. What I find really interesting is just how fast this whole thing has taken off, you know?
Right.
Like this advisory group they've put together, the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, they're calling it.
DOGE, I love it.
Right. Catchy, isn't it? But anyway, they're already having an impact on something like 20 different federal agencies. That's a lot, and it's happened so quickly.
DOGE, catchy, for sure. But from what I've been reading, it's a little, well, mysterious too.
Ooh.
Like it's all about making the government more efficient, cutting costs, all that jazz, which sounds great on the surface, of course.
Sure.
But then there's this whole thing about Elon Musk being a special government employee, and apparently that means there's less financial transparency around what's going on.
Uh-huh.
Doesn't that seem a little strange? I mean, they're talking about efficiency and responsible spending, but
Yeah, it does make you wonder about how transparent they're really being.
exactly.
Especially since Musk keeps saying he's all about maximum transparency.
Right.
But then you get reports, like that one from The Guardian, saying that staffers in DOGE are trying to keep their identities secret, like even withholding their last names from government officials they're working with.
So it's like they want the power of the government, but without anyone knowing who they are or what they're doing.
It does seem that way, yeah.
And what about that whole thing with the Wall Street Journal? They had that reporter, right, who found some, well, let's just say some not so great social media posts from a DOGE staffer.
Ah, right. I read about that.
And Musk tried to get that reporter fired, which just seems, I don't know, the opposite of transparent.
Yeah, it definitely makes you question things, doesn't it?
It does.
And the funny thing is, we only know who these DOGE staffers are because of official channels like those disclosure logs. They didn't exactly volunteer the information, did they?
You'd think with all this talk about transparency, they'd be a little more upfront about who's actually running the show.
You would think.
And speaking of things that sound like they're straight out of a movie, did you see that executive order President Trump signed? It basically gives Musk a ton of power over the federal workforce.
Oh, yeah, that was a big one.
Like cutting jobs, limiting hiring, all in the name of efficiency, of course. But is that much power for someone who's, well, not actually elected? A bit much?
It's definitely an unusual situation. I mean, this executive order lets him completely reshape huge parts of the government and with very little oversight, too. Even people within the White House were surprised by how much influence he suddenly has and how quickly he's moving.
Wow, that's kind of wild. So what's the driving force behind all this, do you think? Like, why is Musk, who's already busy with rockets and electric cars and, all that, so focused on fixing the U.S. government?
Well, based on what he said, he seems to believe it all comes down to transparency, common sense, and making sure that taxpayer money is used properly.
Hmm, sounds good in theory.
In his Oval Office speech, he talked about tackling what he called an unconstitutional branch of government. He was talking about the federal bureaucracy.
So he's saying the system's broken and he's the guy to fix it.
Yeah, that seems to be the argument, and it's one that resonates with a lot of people, I think.
Hmm.
I mean, who doesn't want a more efficient and accountable government? The question is, are his methods the right way to get there?
That's a good question. And it brings us to, well, the elephant in the room. This whole DOGE thing has generated a lot of controversy, hasn't it?
It has.
Some reporters are even using the term hostile takeover, which sounds kind of dramatic, but what are the biggest criticisms people have about Musk and this whole DOGE situation?
I think one of the main concerns is, well, exactly what we were just talking about, the lack of transparency. If we don't know how DOGE is making decisions or what they're actually doing, how can we hold them accountable?
And then there's the whole conflict of interest issue, right? I mean, Musk's companies like SpaceX, they get government contracts. So isn't it a bit of a conflict if he's the one restructuring those same agencies he's doing business with?
Yeah, that's a valid point, and it's one that journalists and ethics experts have brought up a lot. They argue that even if he's delegating contract work at SpaceX, there's still a big potential for conflict of interest there. It just looks bad, doesn't it? Like he could be personally profiting from these decisions he's making about government spending.
Yeah, it doesn't look great. But Musk insists that his companies offer the best value, and he's delegating things so there are no conflicts. Is there any proof that he's actually using this position to make money for himself?
That's where the lack of transparency really becomes a problem. We don't have enough information about what's going on inside DOGE to know for sure. And the fact that they have these special rules about financial disclosures makes it all the more suspicious.
Makes sense. And what about all this talk about government waste and fraud? Is that a real problem, or is Musk exaggerating to make his case stronger?
Well, there's no doubt that any large organization, even the government, is going to have some waste and inefficiency. But some of Musk's claims have been, well, let's just say fact checkers have questioned them.
Oh, really?
Like when he said the Department of Education spent $50 million on one website.
Well,
Turns out it was actually way less than that.
mhm.
So it makes you wonder if he's basing these reforms on solid data or if he already had a plan and is just looking for things to back it up.
So there's a lot of skepticism about what DOGE is really up to. But before we jump to conclusions, I think it's fair to hear Musk's side of the story. He's given interviews and made statements about why he's doing this. What are his main arguments?
Well, he keeps coming back to this idea of bringing private sector efficiency to the government. Cutting waste, making things run smoother, and saving taxpayer money in the process. He says his experience building successful companies like Tesla and SpaceX makes him the perfect person for this job.
So he's saying it's almost his patriotic duty to use his business skills to help the country.
That's one way to put it. He says he's not doing this for personal gain, but out of a sense of responsibility. He thinks the government's gotten too big and inefficient, and it needs an outsider like him to shake things up.
But isn't shaking things up what Congress is supposed to do? I mean, they're the ones we elect to oversee the government and make sure it's running properly. Isn't this stepping on their toes a bit?
Yeah, it definitely challenges the traditional way we think about how power is balanced in the government. Some people are saying that Musk is blurring the lines between the private sector and the government, and that could weaken the role of elected officials and, the whole democratic process.
Wow, so we're talking about a real clash of ideas here. But beyond all the legal and political arguments, what about the human side of this? Like, how are all these changes affecting the people who actually work for the federal government?
Yeah, that's an important point and one that often gets overlooked. These reforms aren't just abstract ideas. They have real consequences for millions of federal employees who are now worried about their jobs and their futures.
I can imagine. And what about the services those employees provide? Everything from national security to social programs. How are those going to be affected by all these changes?
That's a big question and one that deserves a lot more attention. While streamlining things can be a good thing, there's a risk of going too far. We could end up disrupting essential services and actually making the government less effective.
So it's a delicate balance. We've covered a lot of ground already, but it feels like we're just scratching the surface.
We've only just begun to explore the complexities of this story.
Well, stay with us, because in part 2, we'll dig even deeper into the potential consequences of Musk's actions. We'll look at the specific agencies being targeted, the impact on the federal workforce, and the legal challenges that are building up against DOGE.
We'll be back soon. So welcome back to our deep dive. We're still talking about Elon Musk and his pretty ambitious plan to reshape the U.S. government.
Yeah, this story just keeps getting more complicated.
Yeah, doesn't it?
We talked about how DOGE was formed and all the questions about transparency and those potential conflicts of interest. But now I want to focus on what this means for, regular people.
Right.
What are the real-world consequences of Musk's vision for, a smaller, more efficient government?
That's really the key question, isn't it? It's easy to get caught up in the big ideas and the politics of it all, but it all boils down to how these changes affect people's everyday lives.
Right, exactly.
And one of the biggest areas of concern is the potential impact on the federal workforce. We're talking about possible job cuts, hiring freezes, a whole new way of how the government works.
Yeah, I can imagine that's causing a lot of anxiety for people who work for the government.
Absolutely.
But is there a way to, make things more efficient without sacrificing the services that people depend on? It's like saying you want to make a car lighter and faster, but then you take out the engine. Does that even make sense?
That's a great analogy because it really is a delicate balancing act. We need to make sure things run smoothly, but also make sure the government can still do what it's supposed to do.
Yeah.
It's a question of, can you really cut back on staff and resources without affecting the quality of the services the government provides?
Makes sense. And we're not just talking about, the government in some vague sense, are we? It's a huge network of different agencies, each with their own specific job to do. Can you give us some examples of what's at stake here?
Oh, absolutely. Think about the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID. They're the ones who provide humanitarian aid and development assistance all over the world.
Right, I've heard of them.
Now, if their funding gets cut drastically, or if they have to let go of a lot of staff, it could have a huge impact globally. We could see regions become unstable, and it could affect millions of people who rely on that aid.
So cutting costs in one area could actually end up costing more in the long run if it leads to problems in other parts of the world.
That's exactly what a lot of people who are critical of these reforms are saying. They're worried that saving money in the short term could create bigger, more expensive problems down the line.
Yeah, that makes sense. And USI is just one example, right?
Yeah.
Where else is DOGE planning to make cuts?
Well, another target is the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the CFPB.
Okay.
This agency was created after the 2008 financial crisis to protect consumers from predatory lending practices.
Oh, right, yeah.
If it's weakened or even eliminated, it could leave consumers vulnerable to, well, to being taken advantage of by financial institutions. And that could potentially lead to another economic downturn.
So basically, getting rid of an agency like that could actually hurt the economy instead of helping it.
It's definitely a possibility. And then there's the Department of Education. They're responsible for federal funding for schools all over the country.
Right, huge responsibility.
If their role is reduced, it could have a big impact on access to quality education, especially for communities that really depend on that federal support.
So this isn't just about, saving money or making the government smaller. It's
No.
about understanding how these changes could affect real people, the services they need, and, well, society as a whole.
Exactly. And that's where I think a lot of the criticism of Musk's approach comes from.
Also,
He seems to be operating under the assumption that the government is inherently inefficient and wasteful, and that cutting back is the only solution. But a lot of people are saying it's not that simple.
yeah, you can't just apply some kind of formula to something as complex as the government, right?
Exactly. It's not like trimming the fat off a piece of meat. You have to be strategic and think about the potential consequences of making these cuts.
Right. And Musk has this reputation for moving fast,
Yeah.
breaking things and figuring it out later. That might work in the tech world, but can you really do that with something as important as the government?
That's the big question, isn't it? Musk himself has said that he expects to make mistakes and will fix them as he goes along. But mistakes in government can have much bigger and longer lasting effects. It's not like a software update that you can just undo.
Well, it's more like performing surgery. You can't just cut and paste without understanding how the body works.
Exactly. And that's why a lot of experts are urging caution and a more careful approach. They're saying you can't just take private sector ideas and apply them to the public sector without considering how different they are.
Right. And then there's this whole thing about Musk wanting to investigate the net worth of federal employees. He seems to think that if someone is wealthy, they must be corrupt. That seems a little, a little extreme, doesn't it?
Yeah, a lot of people have been raising their eyebrows at that one.
I mean, there's no connection between wealth and corruption. There are lots of reasons why someone might have a high net worth.
Exactly. And critics are saying that it's not just about privacy, it's about fairness and due process. Can you really target people just because they're wealthy?
It sounds like we're getting into some pretty murky ethical territory here.
It definitely raises some important questions that we need to think about carefully. Do the benefits of investigating people outweigh the risks of violating their rights?
That's a tough one. So are there other ways to reform the government? Are there ways to make it more efficient without resorting to such extreme measures?
Oh, absolutely. There are a lot of examples of successful government reforms that have focused on things like making processes more efficient, improving technology, and giving employees more power to address inefficiencies.
So it's not about whether the government can be improved, it's about finding the right way to do it.
Exactly. It has to be effective, ethical, and sustainable. And that's the challenge facing DOGE and Elon Musk right now.
Yeah, big challenge. Well, we've talked about the potential impact on government services and the ethical concerns around Musk's approach. But there's another important piece of this puzzle we haven't discussed yet, the legal battles that are happening around DOGE.
Ah, yes, the legal front. That's where things are really heating up.
Welcome back to the show, everybody. We're in the final stretch of our deep dive into Elon Musk and his grand plans for the U.S. government.
We've covered a lot of ground, haven't we?
We have. From how DOGE got started to the controversies around his methods and the potential impact on, well, everything, from humanitarian aid to consumer protection. But now I want to zoom in on the legal battles that are brewing. Things
Yeah.
are getting pretty intense in the courtroom.
Oh, they definitely are.
It seems like every time I refresh the news, there's another lawsuit being filed against DOGE. Labor unions, state attorneys general, they're all coming out swinging. What are the main legal arguments they're using to challenge Musk's authority here?
Well, a lot of these legal challenges are coming from different angles, but many of them focus on basic constitutional principles, like the separation of powers, the rule of law, due process.
Right, the fundamentals.
Critics say DOGE is acting outside its legal limits, like a shattered government that's ignoring Congress.
So it's not just a question of whether DOGE is a good idea or a bad idea, it's about whether it's even legal at all.
Exactly. And the courts are going to have to decide what DOGE is allowed to do, where its power ends. And we've already seen some pushback from the courts. Remember that judge who issued a temporary restraining order blocking DOGE from accessing Treasury Department funds?
Yeah, that was a big moment. What was the reason behind that decision?
Basically, the judge said there were serious questions about whether DOGE's actions were legal and that letting them continue without any checks could cause real harm to the government and its employees. It was a pretty clear sign that the courts weren't going to just let Musk do whatever he wanted.
And remember that whole thing where Musk retweeted those posts suggesting they defy the court order?
Oh, yeah, I remember.
It didn't seem like he was taking these legal challenges too seriously.
It definitely made people question whether he respects the judicial process and, well, the rule of law in general. It also kind of reinforced this idea that he's used to doing things his way without anyone telling him what to do.
Like he's still in CEO mode, calling all the shots. But now he's hit a system with checks and balances, a system that's designed to prevent any one person from having too much power.
Precisely. And that's one of the core issues here. Can someone who's used to the fast-paced, disruptive world of Silicon Valley really succeed in the slower, more collaborative world of government?
Fascinating question. So where do we go from here? What are the possible outcomes of all these legal battles?
Well, it's hard to say for sure. It's possible the courts could ultimately rule in favor of DOGE and allow Musk to continue with his reforms. But it's also possible they could put limits on what DOGE can do, or even say that DOGE is completely illegal and has to be shut down.
Wow, so a lot of uncertainty still. And what about the political fallout from all this? This whole thing seems to be dividing people pretty sharply along party lines.
Definitely. Musk's supporters see him as a visionary, a leader who's bringing much-needed change to a bloated bureaucracy. They love his bold vision and his willingness to challenge the way things have always been done. But then his critics see him as someone who's reckless, hungry for power, someone who's undermining democracy and tearing down essential government functions. Pretty stark contrast.
It's almost like we're talking about two completely different countries, two different realities.
It really shows how divided American society is today. And this whole DOGE situation has become a flashpoint for those divisions, a battleground for different visions of what role the government should play in our lives.
It's interesting, though, because Musk seems like this forward-thinking innovator, someone who's all about the future. But his ideas about government reform seem kind of old-fashioned, like something from a time when powerful people could do whatever they wanted without being held accountable.
I see what you mean. And it raises important questions about the importance of expertise, experience, and institutional knowledge in government. Can someone from outside the system, even someone as smart as Elon Musk, really understand how government works and make good decisions about how to change it? Or do you need a deeper understanding of how things work, why they work that way, and what might happen if you mess with them?
That's a question we could debate all day. But as we wrap up our deep dive into Musk's mission to change the government, I'm left feeling a mix of, I don't know, awe and a little bit of worry. He's definitely shaken things up, but we still don't know if those changes will be good or bad in the long run.
It's a story that's still being written, and we don't know how it's going to end. But one thing's for sure. This is a story that's going to keep us all thinking and talking, forcing us to ask some really fundamental questions about power, accountability, and what democracy looks like in this digital age.
Well said. A huge thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We encourage you to keep digging into this topic, ask questions, and form your own opinions. We'll be back soon with another fascinating deep dive into the issues that matter most. Until then, stay curious, stay engaged, and we'll see you next time.